Welcome back to Tonight Live. I'm Dan Wootton, and it's time for Uncancelled, where Britain's top commentators speak out on controversial issues without the fear of the cancel culture sweeping the rest of the media. Yesterday saw thousands descend on central London for the biggest anti-lockdown protest yet. The huge turnout marched to make their feelings known to the government about the endless restrictions we have been living under since March last year. And they called for Matt Hancock to resign following revelations that he kissed an aide despite regulations banning intimate contact being enforced at the time. Of course, they did get their wish on that front just a couple of hours later. London was brought to a standstill, yet the media either ignored the demonstrations altogether or denigrated these protesters for freedom as anti-vaxxers, in a move that is both unfair and untrue. So tonight, I'm joined by the host of the weekly current affairs show, Rich Politics, Richard Taylor, who was on the front line at the Freedom March yesterday. He saw firsthand how thousands of people have clearly had enough, and he's here to talk to me about why the march didn't get the coverage it deserved. Richard, it's great to have you. Throughout our chat, we're going to be looking at some of these incredible aerial images of the march, just showing how many people were there. But you were there on the front line, so talk me through it.
Yeah, I most certainly was, and I was there with tens or maybe hundreds of thousands of people. Of course, the BBC didn't find it an interesting story to run. Of course, it doesn't fit their narrative, but to be quite truthful with you, it was one of the most incredible experiences of my life. It was a wonderful occasion. It was a joyous occasion and a sense of normality, which is what people want. You know, people are fed up of politicians intruding into their personal lives and dictating to them how they should live. After 15 months of lockdowns and extension after extension, people have had enough. I mean, one of the largest protests, probably, since the Iraq War protest. This was one of the largest. The BBC, ITV, Sky News, the mainstream media did not cover any of this protest whatsoever. Yet, if it had been a Black Lives Matter protest, it would have been all over our television screens. That tells you all you need to know about the BBC.
So, Richard, how do you explain the fact that these mainstream broadcast networks continue to ignore the lockdown protests? Is it because they view them as being dangerous to public health? Do you think that's what it's about?
I think the BBC are responsible, yes, for scaremongering. I've always believed that. I believe that the narrative and the message that they put out there is that for some reason, those who are pro-choice, pro-freedom, they class us as anti-vaxxers. Now, I can tell you that it was reported by The Guardian. I know you've covered this story already, Dan, on the programme. I've been watching throughout the night since you were on 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock. And it's clear to me that, it was The Guardian, not just The Guardian, but other mainstream media outlets also pigeonholed this as something, as an anti-vaxxer protest. I can tell you that the vast majority of people, and I was there with one of the only politicians I know, Lawrence Fox from Reclaim Party, I was walked with him for quite a few miles, and the love and the sense of joy of people just wanting their lives back. We're fed up of the government just micromanaging our lives and telling us what we can and cannot do. We've seen the same here in Wales. And to top it off, when you've got not just Matt Hancock, we've had politicians here in Wales, for example, in the Welsh Parliament, who broke regulations and laws in December when they told pubs to stop selling beer, but they were found out 4 days later drinking in the Welsh Parliament. The hypocrisy of politicians is what has stirred up the anger in people to say enough is enough. We won't tolerate it anymore. This two-tier system that's been created by the government is not acceptable, and people are waking up to the reality, and I think politicians are now waking up to the reality of it as well. The new appointment of the Health Secretary and Rishi Sunak has come out and said we want to make sure now there is no extension after July the 19th. They're worried because I can tell you this, it was a peaceful demonstration, although it was painted as otherwise, and if you saw some of the footage that they put onto the mainstream media news, they put stuff about Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion, all these other groups that were there at the time campaigning, and they showed the aerial shot as if it was their campaign. I mean, they twist things to fit their narrative. Well, yeah, and to me, it's wrong.
I mean, one of the big issues, Richard, and we have to be fair on this, is obviously yesterday a huge story broke in terms of the resignation of Matt Hancock. But I was looking obviously at the GBNews coverage, which did cover the protest as well as the Hancock News, compared to the other mainstream networks where it was barely covered. But for me, this is all about the trend. And there has been a trend throughout this pandemic not to cover anti-lockdown marches or demonstrations and to denigrate people on those marches or demonstrations as anti-vaxxers. That is a trend that I have seen. And I have a real issue with it, because how can the BBC or ITV or Sky News decide that a march, an anti-racism march or an Extinction Rebellion march, deserves lots and lots of coverage and an anti-lockdown protest doesn't? I have huge issues. So I think you have to talk about the trend. And Richard, presumably this is why you get a sense that a lot of folk are really starting to lose faith in the mainstream media.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I know there was some statistics out just recently this week talking about the trust in mainstream media, that it's gone up since the pandemic, but it's about 36%, which is, when you look at the size of the population, it's nothing. People have no confidence in mainstream media because they're realizing that they are pushing a certain agenda or message that they want you to believe. They have editorial content and control over what the message they want to get out to people. And people on the streets are realizing it's not what's happening out, in their communities. Here in South Wales, where I live, for example, in the valleys, what we see and what we see on the news, they don't correlate. The two don't go together. And we have been fed so much that is woke left nonsense for so many years. And people are now waking up to the reality, and they're saying, look, we've had enough of this. We want something that's right in the middle. And that's one of the things, Dan, I can say to you in GB News, I'm so thankful and grateful to God and anybody else that's out there that GB News has launched this channel, because we needed something that's a bit more balanced, that's not, a lot of these channels say they're impartial, but let's be truthful, they're not impartial. They have their own hidden agendas. And I know from watching GB News since the launch, you've had a whole range of guests with different political views and opinions. And I can tell you this, on the march yesterday as well, there were people from all kinds of different sides of the political spectrum. There were Labour people there, Conservatives. There were all kinds of people there with different political views and opinions. But they came out for one thing, and that was for freedom. Because our freedoms have been taken away from us by politicians who have fed people with fear to control them and almost played God in people's lives in telling them what they can and cannot do. Yet they themselves break the very same rules that they make. So the lawmakers are becoming the lawbreakers, and the people have had enough. And my greatest fear is this, Dan. I'll say this to the viewers. My greatest fear, and I hope, God forbid this would ever happen, because I don't advocate it, that if lockdown happens again, there won't be peaceful demonstrations. I'm afraid people will start to turn to other means, because.
But Richard, in saying that, though, well, number one, I think we should never encourage violence as an answer to anything. I was very outspoken last year about the Black Lives Matter protests that turned violent. I was very outspoken about those ridiculous Extinction Rebellion protests that caused so much damage to people's lives. And I think the only way anti-lockdown protests can be taken seriously is if they stay peaceful. And it's very important that we don't see any of that threatening behaviour that was illustrated the other week towards the Newsnight reporter Nick Watt, because that undermines the cause. So I think it's critical that the protests stay peaceful. I really do. But the question that I would ask you, Richard, is why, if you feel the sense of anger, do the polls consistently show that the British public believe in lockdown, actually like lockdown, and at times actually want the lockdown to be harder?
Well, I think you've answered your own question talking about the BBC, because they're being fed stories about this virus that actually we're going to have to learn to live with, because let's be honest, they're coming up with new variants every single week. It's the Alpha, the Delta. They're working through the alphabet. When's it going to stop? We've got to learn to live with this. And I think what's been happening from politicians up until more recently, and the mainstream media, is we're being told how deadly it is and how bad this virus is. And I'm not playing it down. I believe in it. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. My two eldest sons have had their vaccine, so I'm not against vaccination myself personally, but I'm pro-choice and freedom, and I think that the government,
and I think that's a key point,
using it
Richard,
to take our freedoms away.
Yeah, and I think that's a key point, because I've spoken to a lot of people who were on the marches yesterday. Some are very pro-vax. Others say what they want to be. It's the term that you use, pro-choice. They just don't want vaccinations to be compulsory, and they want people to make decisions about what they put in their own body. But look, let me bring in our panel tonight. Dominic Samuels is a political commentator and columnist and broadcaster. Tom Harwood is the GB News political correspondent. and Richard Power Said is the author and Labour commentator. Now, Tom, you were covering the protests yesterday. Is there anything that you want to pick up with Richard?
Well, I think that it's fairly obvious why the protests didn't get as much coverage as they might have expected. Number one, I was down in Westminster to speak to some of those people on the march just as when Matt Hancock resigned, and suddenly the story in the news agenda completely changed. So we didn't talk about it very much. But I think the other point is that there are lots of marches that happen in London a lot of the time. I haven't been able to walk up Whitehall many times because it's a Palestinian liberation march, or whether it's some sort of ridiculous anti-Brexit march or whatever. I mean, these things happen
not in these numbers,
regularly.
though, Tom.
Fairly regularly,
and
the point is that the only ones that tend to get coverage, as you were mentioning earlier, the Black Lives Matter protest. Do you remember when there was sort of a small group of people who attacked policemen on horses, and all the Extinction Rebellion people who closed bridges that lead ambulances to hospitals? I mean, those are the people that get coverage, not because they're out on a march, but because they're disrupting the communities. And I think that that's a sad and disreputable way.
Richard,
to
how
get media
would you
coverage.
respond to that?
Well, which Richard? Is it me or the other Richard?
You.
I think, when you look at the crowds, Dan, and the images that you've shown, and I think it was Reform TV, Richard Tice was up in a helicopter. I mean, there were, I don't know figures, I can't work it out, but there were streams 4 miles worth. London came to a standstill, literally. I mean, we stopped off in a pub, I think it was the Shakespeare pub, just to have a break, and it went for 45 minutes, and there was still no end to the amount of people that were pouring through, shouting freedom. Yeah. We want our freedom back.
I mean, Dominic, the point is, this isn't just a small demonstration, is it? And that's the issue that people have with the media coverage, Dominic, because if these numbers were out for a cause that the mainstream media tended to support, it would get a lot more coverage.
Yeah, and I think that, you could use the argument about Matt Hancock with regards to this march, but there's been numerous marches where, against lockdown, they've had a large number of people there, and they've lied about the numbers. I remember one a few months ago, they said there were a few hundred people there. They're clearly, from the footage, were thousands of people there, or at least over 1,000 or near that. And I think that the issue with it also is some of the deliberate wording that is used to cover the protest. I was reading a Guardian article. What that chose to focus on was police numbers and how many police would be there, and highlighting the word anti-vaxxer and really highlighting small fringe groups of people. But the aim of that is to delegitimise the wider movement, because I think, in their view, these protests are a risk to public health. And I do remember, when there was a protest before Freedom Day, before the 4-week delay, and people were like, well, why are you protesting? We're going to be free soon. And those people look really stupid because we weren't free, were we? Yeah. I think the protests are necessary. And I think fair coverage is also necessary.
Richard Power Said, I imagine you have a different point of view to Richard Taylor on this. So do you want to have a go?
Well, I mean, I have a certain amount of sympathy, having organised a few protests that didn't get much media coverage myself over, in the last decade or so. I mean, I remember going on numerous anti-austerity marches 10 years ago, where there were just as many people, just as many miles of people marching around central London about a very newsworthy subject. Didn't get any attention whatsoever in the media, including in the right-wing newspapers that have been giving you attention. I just think if you're doing the same protest on a regular basis, if there's nothing particularly exciting happening, if there's a fringe group who are more exciting, then they're going to get the attention. There's always this issue of the police say, quote, one number, and that's what the media quotes, and then the organisers quote a different number.
Can you address the numbers, though, that they misreport? Can you address that?
Well, no,
you're not addressing it.
Can I just jump in and say,
when the report
let Richard Taylor come in. Let Richard Taylor come in.
Yeah, this is not just about a political issue, right, over lockdowns. This is to do with us as human beings. The fact that people have lived with these restrictions for so long, and the impact this has had on people long term, the exponential devastation on people's mental health, the economy. We are yet to see the devastating effects that these lockdowns have had on people. I'm not saying lockdowns were wrong at certain times, at certain places, but some of the disproportionate measures that were put in place. For example, here in Wales, we had shops selling non-essential goods, essential goods. Pubs were told you can open, but you can't sell beer. That's like telling a butcher you can open, can't sell meat. Some of these regulations and restrictions were absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
And people at home and people in pubs when they finally opened here in Wales, certainly, were sitting there thinking, what the hell are the government doing? And I believe that they've put so much fear into the hearts and minds of people that people now are fearful. You mentioned tonight on the programme about children not going back to school, horrendous figures because parents are fearful. Where's this fear come from? It's come from mainstream media and politicians that have been feeding this narrative to the public, and people like myself yesterday in that protest march, it was all about freedom, not just now, because we know some restrictions have been lifted, and 19th of July, God willing, everything will open, but it's about the future. I do not want my children in the future to be wearing masks, to be socially distancing. I want them to live their lives. I'm here to live and to die, not to die from the fear of dying. And that's how everybody should be feeling, because we want our lives back and we want normality back.